Okay, teen growth group for June 24th. We're a little off schedule, so here is our video for this week. Again, we're moving along through Romans, observation, interpretation, application. Those are really straight lines. Great. Here's what we're doing. We're moving forward similar to last week, and I wanted to just give a brief reminder and overview for those of you who are not there. First, let's read the text together. Romans 7. Or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful desires, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Here's what we're going to do, and hopefully you do this even before you come to teen growth group. We are going to go through and observe. I'm going to do that. You can watch it, follow along, do it on your own, and then we're going to interpret, and then we're going to move into the application, right? So remember, observation, we're really just focusing on what does this say, right? So not getting too crazy, and then what does it mean? So we'll start with what does it say, okay? What does it say? Let's go blue with this. Let's look. Observations. Do you not know, brothers? Okay, so he asks this question. He says, I am speaking. So who is he speaking to? To those who know the law. He's making a point here. He says, don't you know that the law is binding on a person only as long as that person lives? Okay, so this again is a rhetorical question. That's an observation. Whoa, rhetorical. You can read it. And then, for a married man is bound. Why is he talking, or a married woman? Why is he talking about a married woman? He's giving us an example. Wow, my writing is supreme today. Party on. Example. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. Okay? So we're getting an example here. Talks about a marriage bound by the law. So we're talking about the law a lot. But there's a time length. These are all just observations. But if this happens, then something is a result of that. Now she's released. Okay, let's keep going. Just making observations as we go. Accordingly, that's an important word. What's that telling us? Seems to start a new thought. We'll come back to that. This is what's going to happen, though. Should we call it an adulteress? Ooh. If she lives with another man while her husband is still alive. But remember, Paul likes to do this back and forth. If her husband dies, so but if this happens, now something else is a result. Right? So remember we talked about this last week. This is kind of scenario 1. Did this just stop working? What's going on? That's 1. This is scenario 2. Under this one, she is not an adulteress. So under 1, she is. Under 2, she's not. Then, look at this word, likewise. The example is now over. So verses 2 and 3 are used as an example to make the point of what he's saying. Likewise, so you say, hey, okay, I made my point in verses 2 and 3. Now, for you, he says brothers, but he's talking to all people, brothers and sisters. You've also died to the law Okay? You have also died to the law. Already has happened. How? Through the body of Christ. And then so that, whenever you see so that, we should observe and say, ooh, so that, there's a reason. What's the reason? Right here. You may belong to another. To him who has been raised from the dead. So who do we belong to? We talked about this last week about being slaves to him. This is Jesus. In order, this is the why. In order that, there's a reason. This is our purpose. Okay? Let's keep going. We'll come back and interpret in a second. We're just making observations. For while we were, used to be, that's past tense, right? That says past. Deal with it. For while we were living in the flesh, this is a description. What did life used to be like? Life used to be this. Our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work. They were in our members. We talked about members last week. Every part of you. Wow. Such good handwriting today. And what do? We talked about this last week as well. They bear fruit for death, right? Your members, which are your heart, your soul, your thoughts, your words, every part of you, are sinful passions. They used to do this, right? They used to lead us, they were at work, and they used to lead us to bear fruit for death. But now, ding, 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 ding. You see how the first couple words of each verse are so important to take note. Because we went from we were up here to now we are. We are what? We are released from the law. Remember, he used the marriage example. While you're under the law, certain things have to happen, and there's certain circumstances to being under the law. If you're married, you're under the law, married to that person. But if your husband dies, you're now released. So he's saying the same way, marriage being the example, in the same way, having died to that which held us captive. Remember, we talked about this last week. We were slaves. We were held captive by our sin. Now we're no longer held captive. Once you've come to Jesus, you're set free. The prison gates are swung open. And then, this is that important part. So that, this is the reason we serve in the new way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. The written code equals the law. Right? Okay, hopefully you're tracking. Why is he talking about the law and the Spirit? He's trying to make the point that he started last week of living according to the law, which we can't uphold, to living by the Spirit that has been given to us through Jesus. Now let's interpret a little bit. We got a lot of observations, okay? Hopefully you're tracking with the flow. We got verse 1, rhetorical question, right? It says, do you not know? Speaking of those who know the law. So he's talking to people who would be familiar with the law of the Old Testament. And he said, hey, you should know this. The law is binding on a person only as long as he lives, right? Once you die, you're no longer under the law. For example, the married situation. If you marry someone and you go to a wedding, they might say something along the lines of, till death do us part. Guess what? If you are married to someone and your spouse dies, you are no longer married. You would be now considered a widow, but all the legal ramifications of being married, good or bad, are now released and gone, right? So he says this, if the woman's husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. Remember, this is just an example. We don't need to get hung up on the marriage part, although there's a lot we could say about that. And he says, accordingly, so if your husband is still alive and you live with another man while he's alive, this is what you get. You're an adulteress, right? Shouldn't do that. But on the contrary, if her husband dies, she's now free from the law of marriage, right? If her husband dies and a guy wants to ask her on a date, she can say yes. She's not under the law of marriage anymore. She can even marry another man and not be an adulteress. Are you seeing how death and law interact? Again, this is an example. Verses 2 and 3 are example. Put this here, 2 and 3. Running out of room. Those are examples. Wowee. Then we go back to number 4. Likewise. Okay? Likewise is a word that we should keep track of and say, ooh, okay. So example's been given. Now back to what I was saying in verse 1. You have, see it, died to the law through the body of Christ. When you come to Jesus, your old self dies through Jesus. That's why we have baptism, that you be buried and raised again. So if you've come to faith in Jesus, he's reminding us, you've died to the law. So therefore, you are not bound to the old way of living, right? So that you may belong to somebody else. You used to be a slave to sin, and now you've been raised from the dead, and you belong to him who did that, right? Right here, boom, Jesus Christ. But there's purpose. The purpose is important. Why have we been raised from the dead? So that we could feel really good about ourselves, so that we could have peace, sure, but there's also another reason right here, that we may bear fruit, not for ourselves, not for our own puffing up of how we are, but for God. Jesus saved you so that you would then in turn belong to him as a slave to righteousness and bear fruit for God. Then he says, look, you used to be doing this. Remember, in your past, you were living by your flesh, by your sinful desires, and you've experienced this. What did they get you? Talked about this last week a little bit. It leads you to death. Nothing good. But now we're released. No longer do we have to keep sinning. No longer do we have to keep running to the things that we once ran to. But every part of you is released from sin, having died. And so now you're not a captive to the law anymore, right? We can X that out. Now you serve in a new way of the Spirit. And as we heard last week, this leads to life, right? Or the old way, that leads to death. Okay, a lot of stuff here in just 6 verses. Hopefully you're tracking some of it, grasping some of it. This was a very quick run through. So let's go here. These are some of our traditional questions that we can do as a group. Let's go green. What does this say about God? What does this say about me? And then this is our big application piece. What must I do? Okay. So if this is true, if you're no longer bound by sin, you're no longer under the law that you used to be under. Again, think about the marriage example. Your spouse died. You were bound to your spouse, but now your spouse has died. Now what must you do as a result? How can you live differently this week as a result? Be ready to discuss, talk about it, and then pray that we would actually do the things that we would set out to do this week.